My dad was born here, but both his parents are from Greece. And when his father came over, he entered Ellis Island as Harilaus de Lucis and left as Harry Wilson. So we're actually Harilaus, not Haralambos, which is less common, but it's our family name. And of course, I'm named after my grandfather. And then my dad was born in Johnstown, New York, where I grew up. My mom is from a small chorion in Greece near Kadiza. It's called Smokovo.
So your mom comes from a small town country background in Greece, but you had the same experience growing up here in New York.
Johnstown, for those people who don't know it, it's about a town of about 10,000 when I was growing up, about 8,000 people now. It's about an hour northwest of Albany. It was, when my grandfather came over, an industrial center. In fact, Johnstown and Gloversville, our large rival, manufactured about half the gloves in the United States at that point in time. And classic, upstate New York industry, it was decimated by foreign competition, eventually moved overseas and resulted in extraordinarily high unemployment rates. And that was the environment I grew up in. But frankly, my dad was a bartender and was steady employment, and so we had a very happy childhood. But as I grew older and became more aware of that, a number of things came forward. One was, I just had a happy childhood and a great environment and a great town, and the values that we learned in that environment of kind of hard work and working to get ahead were really infused my life. But secondly, you learn about the challenges of the state. And upstate and downstate have different challenges, but they each have significant challenges. And I think a lot of it is driven by, we have the worst business climate in the country. We have the highest tax burden in the country. We have the worst regulatory structure in the country. I tend to be very direct, very straightforward, sometimes too direct, and explain to people exactly where I'm coming from. And I think that tends to build trust. So that's just my general personality. And I found when I did that in business, it worked. I even had some people say to me that I was too honest, that sometimes you should be a little bit more gray. I said, no, my whole approach is about being honest, because then people I know can trust me. So there's one deal several years ago where we were negotiating a deal, and I needed to get a bunch of other investors signed up. And I got about a dozen other investors to sign up within 24 hours to give me blanket authority to negotiate on their behalf. That never happens. The reason they did it was because they trusted me. And I think it's a shame, because we have so much tremendous untapped potential in the private sector, so much personal talent, so many great resources, that if we could just use those and basically liberate them from the excessive burdens of the state, I think we could have a much more robust economy. And particularly, whether it's downstate or upstate, have kind of much better job creation in the private sector. I think there's a major disconnect between policymakers and the needs of the private sector. Oftentimes because those policymakers have no private sector experience. So I can't tell you how many retired politicians I've met who went in and got a job in the private sector after leaving public life and said, geez, if I only knew the impact of the things I voted for when I was voting for them, I wouldn't have voted for them. And of course that's not good enough, because now we're stuck with those bad policies. So I think it's people in office who in many cases are well-intentioned, in some cases are catering to special interests, but who are passed these policies without thinking through basically a cost-benefit analysis. So something that sounds good, and the worst example of that is unfunded mandates, where the state will pass something, create a mandate on a local government. Again, it sounds good, but no one actually steps back and says, well, let's look at the cost of this program, and is it worth it? And that's one role the comptroller should be playing, because the comptroller has the power to audit every dollar state and local spending. And I think if properly utilized, the comptroller can say, hey, this program is going to cost localities X $100 million a year. And that may be worth it, but let's be honest with ourselves about the cost of that program so we can make an assessment based on the facts rather than just politics. But I think it's absolutely critical to have bipartisan coalitions, because a lot of these issues are beyond Democrat and Republican. There are certain issues that are clearly philosophical and ideological, and those will always be dividing points for people. But on these fiscal issues, where we generally know that a lower tax, kind of well-structured environment is generally better for business and job creation. And, the majority of Democrats agree with that, the majority of Republicans agree with that. And it's just a question of kind of making those tough choices. And so what we end up having is not a Democrats versus Republicans, but frankly professional politicians who are aligned with special interests, and citizens, Democrats and Republicans, who are the victims of that and are paying for that. And so I think, for those people who can kind of transcend petty partisanship and focus on principles, I think that's a way forward. What I've been trying to do is really kind of appeal to that broad center, and basically, all of my contributions are from individuals, and almost all of them, like 95, 98%. And so as a result, I'm kind of appealing to that broad message and not being tied up with individual special interests. And I think that's an important part of it. I think the disclosure is important. I think it's okay on disclosure. I think it's a where it gets more complicated is the party contribution. So the individual candidates have to disclose a lot, but the parties have unlimited housekeeping accounts, for example. That
So should that be addressed?
I think so, because I think that's the only way to really kind of know where people's resources come from.